this is a really important story to tell, and to understand this is particularly now, because, as I was saying before, race is central to our story. Race, race, race. And a lot of people don't like that. And a lot of people don't want to hear about it.
Welcome to the End Game. I'm Tom Shanahan, and my co-host is Herman Bulls. And our special guest today is Damian Thomas. He's the curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He's a PhD professor, has been at Georgetown, Maryland, and UCLA. And he's going to join us to discuss a new book being released called Game Changers. And Herman, why don't I hand it off to you, and you welcome Damian Thomas with this great subject to discuss.
Well, Damien, it's a pleasure to meet you. And just so that all of the listeners know that the museum is part of the Smithsonian Institute. And I got to tell you, it's a special place for me because my family, as a matter of fact, we're going to have an event there in November where we're recognizing my wife, recently deceased, Lieutenant Colonel Iris Bulls, where we're going to have a special presentation in the military section of the museum, recognizing and dedicating the entrance to that area to her for the great service that she had, not only to the military but for our nation. So Iris Bulls, retired Lieutenant Colonel, presidential appointee in the military, who unfortunately left us too soon due to pancreatic cancer. And my sons, Herman Jr., Nathaniel, Jonathan, and our daughter-in-laws, Jen and excuse me, Jen and Brittany. And we have 4 great grandkids. When they listen to this 50 years from now, they'll know. And that's Connor, Quinn, Kennedy, and my newest, Justin. So, Damien, this is super special for me because our family has been associated with the museum since it opened. We've had corporate events there to bring people over to open their eyes to really the challenges, as well as the great attributes and accomplishments from the history. And many of the things that you get to cover on the sports front is about the thrill of victory, somewhat the agony of defeat, but the museum overall, the agony of defeat is definitely there, to use a sports term. However, the thrill of victory in terms of showing how African Americans have used their prowess in athletics and academics, I'm going to say, to make great contributions to the world. So, Damien, welcome, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I am looking forward to the conversation as well. And it's interesting because we're going to talk about sports, but you start with the military. And I'm really excited for the event that you laid out. The military gallery in our museum is particularly important because it was a group of African American soldiers who were the first to really advocate for this museum in 1915. So this museum took 100 years to get built. In 1915, it is an important year because it was the 50th anniversary of the end of slavery and the end of the Civil War. So as Americans came back to Washington, D.C. to commemorate that moment, to think about the lessons, some African American soldiers who were alive, who were veterans of that war, also came back and advocated for this space. They were unsuccessful, and we got it done 100 years later. And so when we were thinking about which galleries had to be in the museum, certainly the military gallery needed to be there. And what's powerful about the military gallery and the sports gallery is that they're on the same floor on opposite sides, because in many ways, those are the two institutions to give African Americans opportunities on relative terms of equality. And so they, in many ways, are at the the core of what we call our community gallery, which is premised around this idea of making a way out of no way, and how African Americans, generations, successive generations, have had a responsibility to continue the legacies of those generations which came before. So thank you for sharing your wife's story. And I'm really excited to hear that she will be honored and recognized in our museum.
Yeah, Herman is a true pioneer on his own. He was the first black quarterback at his high school in 1973. A lot of people today, younger kids, black and white alike, don't realize segregation was still an issue in those days. We were shedding the segregation years. And then Herman was recruited by the great Gary Steele, the first black letterman at Army West Point in 1966. That wasn't that long ago. And then Herman went on to graduate from West Point. He's a retired colonel, one of the top leading executives in America, and in the Alabama Business Hall of Fame. So we're going to talk about the new book, Game Changers. And Damien is going to comment about the photos that he's selected for us to discuss. And I want to point out, first of all, that this is kind of related to a chapter in my book, The Right Thing to Do, The True Pioneers of College Football Integration in the 1960s. Chapter 15 is about statues of pioneers in college football integration in various campuses around the country. It wasn't really a popular thing until Iowa State kind of started it with Gene Smith, who recently retired as the Ohio State athletic director. He was at Iowa State then, and they renamed their stadium for Jack Trice, a black player in the 1920s who tragically died from internal injuries when he took a lot of cheap shots. And gradually, more and more schools, including in the segregated South, formerly segregated South, Kentucky and Tennessee, schools like that, starting putting up statues. And I have a quote in my book that kind of sums up the purpose of these statues, as well as the pictures we're going to discuss. From Dr. Lewis Moore. He's a PhD professor at Grand Valley State. He has a new book out about the Doug Williams and black quarterbacks. The quote from Dr. Moore was talking about statues on campuses. These are great opportunities for schools to wrestle with the past. We can celebrate the guys and look internally at what happened. But then I think we worry it dissipates. Everybody pats themselves on the back, but we move on. And that's kind of what we're going to do with these photos. We're going to remember how important these people are and try not to move on, to try to keep them in our consciousness. Damien, why don't you start out discussing the purpose of the book?
Oh, great. Well, this is part of a series. So the museum has a book series called Double Exposure, where we share photographs from the museum's collection. We have about 25,000 photographs in total in our collection. And one of the most important things about this book is that the museum recently became the co-owners, along with the Getty Research Institute, of the Johnson Publishing Company archives. And if you're not familiar with that name, Johnson Publishing, think about Ebony Magazine, Jet Magazine. These were core African-American publications during the 20th century. And the Johnson family decided to make these artifacts available for purchase. 4 million images documenting Black life in the 20th century. Just an incredible collection. And so a number of foundations came together, including the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, to purchase this archive to ensure that it was protected and held together. And our museum in Getty are charged with stewarding this collection and making it available to the public. So it is a daunting task, but an incredible opportunity. And so the first images that the museum will publish from that collection are in this book. So we started with 2,200 images and had to whittle it down to 60, a representative core of all of the incredible photographs that we had in our collection. It was a daunting challenge, but I think we selected a cross section of photographs. One of the things that we had to consider with that many photographs to choose from is what's going to be the focus of this book. Is the focus of this book going to be the Black body in motion? Is the focus going to be about the political struggle and fight for social justice? Is this book going to be about African-American athletic excellence? Is this book going to deal with both athletes on and off the field? And we had to wrestle with those questions. How would we frame this particular collection? And instead of choosing one of them, what we tried to do is to incorporate all of them, to create a book which looks at the meaning of athletics and sports from a multifaceted perspective. And ultimately, we also had to produce a book that was consistent with our exhibition on sports, which is called Sports Leveling the Playing Field. And what we try to do in that space is not to create a Hall of Fame. So it's just not a book, an exhibition about incredible African-American athletic achievement and accomplishments, but rather what we try to do in that space is to tell African-American history through the lens of sports. And so for us, sports are often our entry point to larger political, social, and cultural conversations. So while the book is not a photographic history of the exhibition, it certainly embodies the spirit and the goal of what we try to do in our exhibition.
Well, Damien, I want to follow up on that because I think that's so great, and we do need those athletic heroes and to do things. But I'll just talk a little about my story. Not only, as Tom mentioned, I was the first full-time starting Black quarterback, but I was also president of the student council, and at a school that was 16% Black. And I'm saying that to say I think the message that we want to send to those who are in the later part of their years, but primarily to the youth, sports is a means to an end. And I think you're just not focusing on the superstars and all the money that they make. What about the other people that did things and not being totally altruistic, like this little Black boy named Herman Bulls in Florence, Alabama, that went on to do those things and ended up at West Point, Harvard Business School, Alabama Business Hall of Fame. Okay, that's an important story to tell as well. And we've got to make sure that our youth understand that those possibilities are out there, that it takes perseverance, it takes discipline, and it takes hard work to get there. But I'm hoping that this book will be a motivator for the older people to encourage the younger people to use sports again as a means to an end.
I think you're absolutely right, is that we have to think about sports not just for the sake of competing, but also to understand and recognize the social value and significance of sports. And that's important culturally, and we do this in the book because one of the things that's unique about the United States is how closely sports are tied to our academic institutions. If you travel around the world, you don't really see schools with as vigorous sports programs as we have in the United States. And that's because of the classic idea of healthy mind, healthy body, this idea that athletic ability and athletic accomplishment kind of go hand in hand and they support each other. And that has to do a lot with why African Americans have been so invested in sports. Because sports, on one hand, has been a space which has opened the door and given African Americans a chance to compete on relative terms of equality. And what African Americans have tried to do with their athletic success is to say, that if you give us the same level of opportunity in business and medicine and law, you'll see the same level of accomplishment. And so I think that's been crucial to why sports have had such an important space in African American history and culture.
Yeah, right. Good stuff. Well, let's move on to discussing the photos. Full disclosure, two of my favorite ones are because they're athletes I knew during my sports writing career. Gail Devers, the Olympic champion, I knew her as early as a high school athlete. And then Magic Johnson was at Michigan State when I was there, proudly working for the school's college newspaper, the State News. The first section we're going to do is 1900 to 1945. Jumping rope and Jack Johnson. Go ahead, Damien, comment on these photos, and we'll put them on the screen for our viewers to see.
Well, I want to start with the Jack Johnson photo first because it is the very first photograph in the book. This image of his 1910 fight with Jim Jeffries. Now, African American sports history existed before that, but we started with this image because this, to this day, might be the most important sporting event in African American history and perhaps even US history. At a time when the heavyweight champion was considered to be the epitome of masculinity, of manliness. Jack Johnson had won the title in 1908. And when he won, Jim Jeffries was asked to come out of retirement to take the title away from him. So this image of these two men in the center of the ring on July 4th, 1910 in Reno, Nevada, and the importance of that day, American Independence Day, this fight, which notions of racial supremacy and white supremacy are being fought over. This fight has tremendous implications. There are 100,000 people in the audience. And Jack Johnson won this particular fight. And what does this mean? What does this mean that an African American has defeated the great champion Jim Jeffries and is continuing to be the heavyweight champion? One of the outgrowths of this fight is that there were race riots all over the country in which white moms went in African American communities to reinforce the message that, yeah, before the fight, we said this was going to be meaningful. But now that he's won, we don't want you to get any ideas about equality or equal treatment. And so at least a dozen African Americans lost their lives in the mob violence that happened after a boxing match. And then once Johnson lost the title in 1915, it would be over 20 years before another African American was allowed to fight for the title, when Joe Louis became undeniable as an athlete worthy of competing for that title. So this is a fight and a sporting event which had ramifications far beyond the world of sports. And we thought that was an appropriate place to begin this book.
Well, let's talk about our aunt in the basement and the fact that he was married to a white woman and was linked with several other women in this time and somewhat even to this day. That's a taboo. So what impact do you think that had on the social progress of our nation?
It's an interesting question because Jack Johnson was married to and involved with a number of white women. And the challenge of this moment is really complicated because the white women that he was associated with were typically working women. And when I say working women, I mean women of ill repute. And so, what he's seen is debasing white womanhood on multiple levels. One, because of interracial romance, but also because of the particular occupations of the women that he was involved with. And so that certainly helped infuriate people. You also have the fact that one of his wives committed suicide, which also sort of enraged people and brought these notions of interracial romance to the forefront. And many people say that a very famous and influential movie, Birth of a Nation, was about him, was inspired by him. And Birth of a Nation was a movie 1915, which looked back at Reconstruction, but also was about this new moment where we are going to see the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. And that book is essential, excuse me, that movie, Birth of a Nation, is essential to that moment. Many scholars have also gone back and tried to suggest that the story of King Kong is the story of Jack Johnson. And so King Kong also sort of captures this white woman, and it becomes this story. And so this was a part of his life which had ramifications far beyond his own personal decisions and impacted how people saw race and racial opportunity and the potential of integration as key issues to avoid in American society.
Yeah, and you mentioned Joe Louis. When he did come onto the scene, his managers were very careful to tell him never celebrate knocking out a white man, be humble, because they didn't want to infuriate people. And then, of course, as history played out, he beat the Nazi Max Schmeling, which made him a hero everywhere. But that's a whole nother story. Let's move on to the photo about jumping rope. Tell us the significance of that one.
Sure. I chose that image. You know, when you're putting in some photographs, you want to have some things that surprise people. And oftentimes people don't think of jump roping as a sport. Maybe people think about it as a leisure activity, but I wanted to include it because I think it's reflective of a key and important moment from this period between 1900 and 1945. And that is the movement of African Americans from the South to the North to the Midwest and also to the West Coast, the great migrations that accompanied World War I and World War II. And so what we see in this photo is a group of girls in the snow, twirling the ropes, jumping, and kind of finding space in a new environment to bring aspects of African American culture to the forefront. And so I thought it was a photograph which allows us to, one, kind of see the physicality, but also to see the play elements of these physical feats. And so I also thought people would find it a bit surprising. And so I was happy that we were able to include it.
Herman?
Well, I can remember Double Dutch as a kid growing up in the South, and it was recreation while the adults after dinner were sitting on the front porch. You kids get out of here, go out and do something active. So certainly more physically active than the Nintendo and all the games that the kids do to these days. So I think Damien, that picture will bring back, evoke a lot of memories of people, particularly from my generation, of their childhood, and it's just something that I associate with my childhood.
Okay, let's move on to the next section, 1945 to 1968. You have a photo of Jackie Robinson registering voters, not playing baseball. And I like that because it was difficult for a black man to stand up for civil rights back then. Willie Mays and Hank Aaron, or I shouldn't say Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron was proactive. Willie Mays and some other black athletes have been criticized for not being more, taking a more proactive stance. But Jackie Robinson put himself out there in so many ways. Talk about Jackie.
Indeed. In the book, we do have a couple of photos of Jackie Robinson and his athletic feats. You know, oftentimes when we talk about Jackie Robinson, you know, we think about the off the field meaning of him, but we also have to acknowledge that Jackie Robinson was a Hall of Fame baseball player, and he was played at a Hall of Fame level. He's a 311 hitter. He was someone who led the Dodgers to multiple pennants during this time and won World Series and was the MVP of the league one year. And so Jackie Robinson was also someone who brought Negro League styles of play and base running back into the games. Prior to Jackie Robinson, and even after Jackie Robinson, you know, Babe Ruth was the standard. Everybody wanted to hit home runs. And Jackie Robinson brought base running back to the game. Early in his rookie season, you know, people were unhappy to have him, so they would hit him with the ball, which put him on first base. Jackie Robinson would steal second, and somebody would hit a single, and here's Jackie Robinson rounding third, scoring. And after a while, after he got hit about 7 or 8 times early in that first season, people started to see, well, this isn't working. So then they stopped throwing at him as much as they had been. So we have images of him as an athlete, but we also wanted to emphasize the ways that Jackie Robinson was committed to social justice off the field as well. You know, he was the most popular speaker, even more popular than Martin Luther King Jr. for a couple of years in terms of at the NAACP and being a speaker at fundraising kind of banquets. He was someone who was always pushing for more and lending his voice to causes. And, you know, it's interesting that by the end of his playing career, he was one of the most hated men in the sport of baseball. People thought he was a bit too grand, that he was too outspoken. People wanted Jackie Robinson to be a symbol of progress. They wanted to be able to point to Jackie and say, look at what we did. Look at how far we've come. But Jackie was always saying and reminding people that we can do more. There's more that we can do, that we can accomplish. Even before he died, Jackie Robinson was invited to address America at the World Series in 1972, 25 years after his playing career began. And in that speech, the memorable line is, how come we don't have any African-American managers? And he's pushing for more. And people are like, oh, here's Jackie advocating for more, always dissatisfied with the level of progress. And so people didn't like Jackie because he just wouldn't allow America to celebrate. But he continued to advocate and push and demand more. And this image was really evocative of his continued desire to make America better and have America live up to his ideals. And so I just thought this was a picture that we had to include.
And I wonder, Damian, as we think about how Jackie Robinson certainly set the stage with integration of the white baseball, I'll say, but we know the Negro League existed, and the Satchel Pages of the world and many other great ones were there. What impact do you think this is going to have as we look at the Major League Baseball now and the number of Blacks at that level versus Dominicans and other people of color, and the fact that it's I think it's down in the single percentage digits, the last information I saw. What do you see going on there?
Yeah, African Americans make up roughly about 8% of the players. What's interesting is that African American fans make up about 3% of the baseball viewing population. So it's a sport that has not been as popular in Black America. But what's interesting to me when you think about the Negro Leagues and their legacy is that African Americans from the playing in the Negro Leagues had to go down to Cuba and the Dominican Republic to play. And so what they were able to do was to teach African American styles of play, Negro League styles of play. And so even today, as we see the Afro-Latino players dominate, we still see vestiges of the Negro Leagues in terms of that playing style. Certainly the short stop, the small ball. That's how we still see the Negro Leagues today. So I always want to acknowledge that we still see their influence and their impact. It also has to relate, I also think when we think about the decline, we have to think about the economics of baseball. The way baseball works is that internationally, if you sign a player at 15, 16 years old, you identify talent, you can keep them in your system and sign them and bring them to the major leagues. And so teams are investing in their academies in these Caribbean and South American countries and really trying to develop the talent there and to keep them in their system. Whereas if you develop talent domestically, they go into the draft and you can't control where they go or just sign the players that you've developed locally. And so the structure is designed for teams to invest internationally rather than domestically. Although there are a couple of major league teams which have really tried to create youth academies to be engaged in youth sports. And I think in baseball, one of the other challenges is how expensive it's become to be an amateur athlete, really across sports. It's a little bit easier, I think, in basketball because so many of the teams are subsidized by the shoe companies. But when you don't have that in baseball and other things, it can often cost $20,000, $30,000 the level of travel and equipment that you need. And that's cost prohibitive across sports.
Yeah, that's very interesting about the Negro Leagues still being seen through our Caribbean players. That's fascinating. All right, let's move on to 1968 to 80. And we'll start out with the great Muhammad Ali.
Sure, this is one of my favorite photos in the book. It almost has this spiritual quality. You can kind of see the fog in the air and Muhammad Ali at the center of this image being interviewed by Tom Hammond after his fight with Jerry Quarry. And this fight was his first fight after getting banned, after he spent 3 years exiled from the sport because he refused to go fight in the Vietnam War. And when I say fight, I mean boxing, because what's interesting about Muhammad Ali and his being drafted into Vietnam, the Vietnam War, was they wanted him to reprise the role of Joe Louis during World War II. And they wanted him to go do boxing exhibitions to entertain the troops. So Muhammad Ali was never going to pick up a gun and get close to the front line. And so it's always important that I think we remember that, is that this was a principled stand against the war. And what's interesting about the Vietnam War is that it is the first war that African Americans didn't support. Because prior to the Vietnam War, African Americans had tried to use their war service, their patriotism, to advocate for greater rights and greater freedoms. What happens with Vietnam is that, one, Vietnam replaces civil rights as President Johnson's #1 concern. And secondly, African Americans are 10% of the population, 32% of people in the military, but 50% of those on the front line. And so this is a war in which African Americans are disproportionately bearing the burden of service. And so those 2 points lead African Americans to oppose the Vietnam War. And Muhammad Ali becomes a symbol of that larger African American frustration and lack of support for this war. And so him taking this fight with Jerry Quarry, it's almost a religious-like moment where you see his cornerman Bundini Brown with his hand on his heart, almost praying for him, realizing that he now has a greater platform and a greater opportunity. And what's interesting about this moment is that Muhammad Ali didn't change. The country changed and began to see the rightness of his position. And so this is just an incredible moment, and I'm really glad that we were able to include this image in this particular book.
Herman.
I don't have much more to say about that in terms of what Muhammad Ali presented for, I'll call it organized defiance, a man of principle, and certainly change things in society for a Black man standing up and saying, I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to do it based on my religious beliefs. And I think he changed the course of history in doing that.
Yeah, the country changed. Ali didn't change. That's a very good point. Let's move on to this women's basketball photo. Women's basketball, of course, is more popular than ever, but you picked out a photo of Althea Gwynn.
Yeah, I think that's a incredibly important moment. This is from the Women's Professional Basketball League, which was founded in 1978 and played through 1981. It is a league which is created in the aftermath of the 1976 Olympics, which was the first time that women's basketball awarded medals. And so men's basketball had been an Olympic sport since the 1920s or 30s. And it's not till 1976 that women's basketball becomes an Olympic sport. And this is also post Title IX, 1972. What's interesting to me about Title IX is we tend to think of it as a sports law. But what it did is outlawed discrimination in higher education for women. And so it actually is a law which led to a fundamental change in terms of opportunity for women. So sports are part of that, but it also speaks to this kind of key moment, because one of the things that happens in the 1950s and 60s, particularly after the Soviet Union enters the Olympic movement, is that if you count only the men's medals, the United States usually wins the medal count and says our social system is better than yours. When you include the men's and women's medals, the Soviet Union usually wins. So during the 1950s and 60s, there's an effort in the United States to minimize and denounce women's sports. And after that kind of proves to be ineffective, then we get Title IX, creating more opportunities for women. We see the women's basketball and other sports, and America investing more in women's sports. And this is a key moment because, many people don't know Althea Gwynn, don't know the story of women's basketball. And it speaks to, I think, this larger issue that Herman started with. And what we know about creating opportunities for girls and women to compete, particularly at the high school level, they have higher grade point averages, less likely to use drugs, less likely to become pregnant, more likely to go to college. 80% of women in the C-suite in corporate America were former athletes. And so this picture is symbolic to me of this larger moment or this larger message that we all benefit. as a country for creating opportunities for women to compete and to play. And so I wanted to have some images that help share that message.
Okay, let's move on to the great Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He gets left off Mount Rushmore when people talk about basketball players too often because there was nobody like Kareem. And then the other thing I always have admired about Kareem is he was a UCLA student when he was at the Cleveland Summit with Jim Brown and Bill Russell and all those guys. So kind of gets back to what you said about Kareem didn't change, the country changed, although Kareem didn't have Muhammad Ali's personality. Go ahead with this photo on Kareem.
Yeah, there are two images of Kareem in this book. One is him in his prayer room, and the other is him slam dunking this basketball with the ball almost at the top of the top of the backboard. It's interesting to me to hear people talk about Victor Wembanyama today. And Victor just does things that nobody else can do, things we've never seen before. And that's the same for Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who, because of the fact that he was coming into the NBA, into the NCAA, changed the rules, said you couldn't slam dunk the ball. You know, this was somebody who was so dominant as a college basketball player, 3 national championships, an incredible winning streak at UCLA.
Maybe would have been 4 if freshmen could have played.
Yes, definitely. Probably would have won 4. Yeah, freshmen couldn't even play on the varsity team. When Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was a freshman at UCLA, they were the defending national championships, and the freshman team won. He was that dominant. And so here is somebody who in more recent times, I think it's become much more known for his political outspokenness, his ability to kind of hold America accountable. But we sometimes forget what an amazing basketball player who just did things that we've never seen before. And so we wanted to also find that balance of having just some pictures which demonstrate incredible athletic ability and aptitude. And so we chose one of those images for Kareem and also included an image of him in his prayer room. Because when he went public, changing his religion to being a Muslim, that was an incredibly powerful moment. And it was something that we started to see more African Americans do, particularly as the Black Power movement sort of became more in vogue, replacing the civil rights movement. I also should make this point about religion and thinking about Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, in a lot of ways, was also not very popular in Black America in the 1960s when he was not popular in white America either. And a lot of it had to do with his rejection of Christianity. This idea that you don't believe in Jesus was something that a lot of African Americans also had a hard time kind of accepting. And so we also see this with athletes like Muhammad Ali and others in the early 1970s who are receiving some level of criticism because of their religious choices as well.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of interesting. It kind of relates to what you said about Jackie Robinson, and they stopped hitting him with the baseball because it wasn't working. Kareem developed a sky hook when the dunk was outlawed, and that probably lengthened his NBA career because he just had so many skills, and nobody's ever really duplicated the sky hook like he did because everybody else plays with the dunk.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. You know, I'm from Los Angeles, and I used to watch the Lakers play all the time with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and you would see Magic Johnson dribble the ball up to the front court, and he would put his fist up, And everybody in the arena knew that meant the ball was going to Kareem. And this is crunch time, end of the game, and you knew Kareem was gonna shoot that sky hook, and nobody was gonna stop it. And it's just still one of the most unstoppable plays in sports history.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the last section, 1980 to today. We're only going to discuss one photo, but certainly there's a ton of photos that could be discussed because we've made so much progress from the 1980s forward. And the photo you chose for us to discuss today is Colin Kaepernick taking a knee.
Taking a knee. And when I was thinking about this image, this is the last image in the book. And it's juxtaposed against the 1910 fight with Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries. The beginning, the first image of the book. And to me, this was such an important moment when Colin Kaepernick took this knee. And what's been interesting is we've seen a lot of athletes speak out and to have something to say about social justice. But what gives this moment power is that it was part of a larger movement. People were protesting in New York over the death of Eric Garner, people protesting in Ferguson over the death of Michael Brown. And what Colin Kaepernick taking a knee did is it forced America to deal with these issues of police brutality that in some ways people were able to say, well, it's that community over there, or it's those people. And so what he does by taking a knee is to nationalize this conversation. And to me, it's important because it's important for athletes to speak out about causes that they believe in. But when there is a movement for which athletes are speaking and responding, the impact of their gestures is magnified and transcends the sports world. And so this was a key moment where his taking a knee drew national attention and helped nationalize this vital conversations around the movement for Black lives.
Herman?
Well, a very poignant moment in terms of what the photo captures, the aftermath of it, and what it had to do with coaches and sports and a league not only in football but basketball, which dominated by African Americans, right? And people had to make a choice and had to make a tough decision. And the fact that he was essentially blackballed, right, from the league for expressing his, I don't know if you want to call it political or social beliefs, is somewhat disappointing. However, at the same time, I think the consciousness of our nation was definitely impacted in a positive way as a result of his actions. And that's what you truly call a leader, because he sacrificed something, right? His well-being in terms from a financial perspective in order to stand for something that he believed in.
I think you're absolutely right. When I think of leaders, I'm always thinking of something that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said. He said, leaders don't follow public opinion, they make public opinion. And so often people have to step out before everybody's ready to kind of engage. And what was interesting about Colin Kaepernick in 2016 is that, most people in the NFL weren't ready. But by 2020, after the death of George Floyd, you had Commissioner Roger Goodell changing and saying, you know what, we were wrong in 2016. And that's the thing about social change and social revolutions. Some people see it early, and it takes other people a while. And part of what you have to do is you have to allow people an opportunity to change and to grow and to adjust. And that's just part of how social change and social transformation works. We have a book which looks at over 100 years of history. And I always remind people, like sometimes people think about the civil rights movement. You know, you teach it in class, and people think it's about 4 or 5 years. You
Yeah.
have to remind people that the what we call the civil rights movement was over almost 25 years from developing the ideas to then fighting, and you get moments where there's progress, and then there's retreat, and then there's a new aspect of the struggle. This social change doesn't happen overnight and is the product of sustained engagement. And so to me, that's why I think that picture is so powerful and still so resonant today.
Yeah, and that's the message that I always try to tell in my books about college football integration. It didn't happen in one night with the Sam Cunningham 1970 Alabama game. It happened with all the events from the 50s and the 60s from true pioneers that set up that game. And well, let's wrap things up. There's obviously we could go on and on because there's so many great photos and so many great moments to talk about. Just about like I've been to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, just like you guys use every available inch in that space. And it's just it's worth the time, and it's I can go back and start all over, and it'll still be fresh. So let's have our final comments. Damien, you go first, and then as usual, Herman will bring us home.
Sure. Just want to thank you for this opportunity to come and share this book. We're really excited about its publication. And we want to invite people to come to our museum. You know, when we opened in 2016, we had planned for people to spend about hour and a half, maybe 2 hours in our museum, because the average dwell time at a Smithsonian is about 75 minutes. And what we saw was that during their first visit, people were spending 5.5 hours in our museum, which is almost unheard of in the museum world and really speaks to the hunger and thirst for this information. And so I hope that all of the people listening will, in the near future, find their ways to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Well, Damien, on behalf of Tom and myself, thank you so much. And one of the great things about doing this, and Tom and I do this out of the goodness of our heart, I learned so much, and I've had the opportunity to meet such interesting people, and you're added to that group. And just a little nuggets. When I asked you the question about baseball, and you explained to me how the Dominican players are influenced by the African American. It just that's a little tidbit I never thought about, and that is just fantastic. And your boss, Lonnie Bunch, obviously the former head of the museum, is a personal friend, and I am so excited again for the event that my family is going to be able to participate in on behalf of my wife, Iris Burton Bowles, and recognizing her contributions. And she had 3 sons that played college sports, so you can imagine we were all around. And what you said about the costs of being on these traveling teams, and her thing, she's a graduate of Virginia State University, HBCU, and they had an issue with their weight room and they needed something. And you guys know how that worked. You got your list of people you call, and they called Iris, and the weight room at Virginia State University is dedicated to and named for my wife. And not only the athletic part of it, she also funded a scholarship endowed there for, she was in language and culture that she worked with at the Department of Defense at the Pentagon. And she endowed we endowed a scholarship to send a Black man or woman overseas every summer to learn more about language and culture. So the athletic part is important. It was important to her. The academic and the cultural part is important to her. And we are so happy to be able to do this in honor of her and her legacy.
Yeah, and that's why I'm also proud and honored to have Herman as a partner, because he can bring a different perspective than I can as an African American. I love researching this, and I'm so proud of my university for leading the way. But it's not a story very well understood throughout America because of it's been overshadowed by myths about Alabama and Bear Bryant and USC, and that's my motivation. And this was something a little bit different we were able to do thanks to Herman's relationship with the Smithsonian. And thank you so much, Damien, for joining us. And share this for everyone who's out there watching. Share this video with all your friends. The end game. This episode will be up on our screen. Go ahead, Damien. You got another comment?
No, I just want to once again say thank you, and I'm looking forward to seeing the episode.
All right, great. Thanks for watching.